propose that we start with a welcome to all of you, to those who accepted to give their comments this afternoon on our position paper. Professor Koen Geens of the Catholic University of Leuven, former Belgian Minister of Justice, and as Minister of Justice, he was also responsible for the salaries of our clergy. He was also Minister for a while of Europe, and currently he is a member of the Belgian Parliament. He is, as we used to say, a man for all seasons, and thus the right person to offer his comments on our paper. The second speaker will be Mrs. Elisa Di Benedetto. Elisa Di Benedetto is the co-managing director of the International Association of Religion Journalists. And in one of her mails, she said, it's very good that you invite also people from the press, because we also have ideas about this topic. So welcome to Elisa too. The third speaker will be Emmanuel van Lierde, who is an editor-in-chief of the Belgian weekly Tertio, a man with a broad perspective. He is responsible for Tertio, and it's a pity that it is only published in Dutch, for otherwise you could all really benefit from it. The fourth speaker, Vincenzo Paciglio, asked to be excused. It was a last-minute excuse, but he sent a lengthy text, and I will summarize that after that the three people present have offered their reflections. So I first give the floor to Professor Koen Geens, and for about 15 minutes, but given the fact that Vincenzo is not here, I will not become nervous when Professor Geens will take 20 minutes. Professor Geens, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear colleague Lambrechts, dear Dean of the Faculty of Theology, whom I always met in the morning while parking my car at the same time with him. He briefly introduced my recent past to you, and of course, to contextualize what I will try to tell you, it is important to see that on the one hand, I am a politician and a Christian Democrat, which is probably not neutral for whatever I'm going to tell you. And on the other hand, I am a lawyer, professor of law, and in that capacity, I was also a Minister of Justice. It's important for you who might live partially in Anglo-American traditions, that in Belgium, the Minister of Justice is not a Attorney General. He's not the head of the prosecution at all. And he is confronted with a prosecution that is totally independent. On the other hand, due to the special way wherein the Belgian Constitution in 1831 accepted and translated the separation of church and state, as Professor Lambrechts said, the Minister of Justice has a special responsibility with regard to paying the priests and the imams and the other people that are going for in religious service and in non-religious traditions, also to the leaders of Freemasons, their monthly salary after having been recognized by their own religion authority or religious authority. I think, my dear colleague, that what you asked me to do is to explain specifically the position of a politician with regard to the different aspects of your position paper, and still more specifically, not to speak in detail about the cases of Mila and Paty, but to give a context wherein ministers of justice in an EU country reflect on such issues. What I always have tried as a Minister of Justice in speaking about the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion and their potential confrontation on certain crossroads is what I would call the intertemporal aspect of the acceptation of certain values and human rights. 50 years ago, homosexuality was not really accepted by the Catholic tradition in my country, and not only not by the Catholic tradition, and today it is. That implies, for me, that we cannot accept that the same pace of acceptance of certain modern or postmodern values happens at the same rhythm in every country or in every society. The same goes for humor, goes for satire, goes for a number of things which in certain countries are standard and which in other countries are not. And the only thing that I always said to the extreme right in my country, extreme right telling that Muslims should accept homosexuality or should accept equal rights for women or should accept whatever was in their view a normal thing in a Western society, that only a few years ago their Catholic fathers and grandfathers were not prepared to do that themselves. That is, for me, a basic position as a politician to speak about these things. Not radical, but with an historical perspective. Second, we should realize at the same time that globalization, and that is very clearly explained in the position paper, that globalization is more than ever the cause of the confrontation of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, because that intertemporality occurs physically or virtually within the same environment. The privilege of certain societies in the past to have several religions within their borders was rare. We had, until not that long ago, the idea in Latin, cuius regio eius et religio. We knew India, we knew certain countries in the Middle East where there were several fractions of Muslim or where there were several religions confronted with one another within the same nation. But it was certainly not the case in many European countries, and where it was the cause of lengthy wars. Nowadays, virtually and physically, many Western countries are confronted with different traditions within their borders, and so with that intertemporality, physically or virtually confronted. And that is something completely new that we didn't know before. And that I'm not referring to Samuel Huntington, but just to the title he used, that clash of civilizations within the same borders or on the virtual internet is, of course, a tendency that sharpens opposite views and that makes it much more difficult to master those opposite views. And at the outset, I want to admit that there are no easy solutions. This is one of the most complex problems that civilization has ever been confronted with. And we should go about it with a lot of nuance and understanding. The political ambition in a democratic society that is confronted with that intertemporality within the same borders or on the same internet was for me threefold. First, as a Minister of Justice confronted with the terror era between 2013 and 2017, I maximally tried to concert with the leaders of the religions in Belgium and of the non-religious convictions. Almost every 2 months, we tried to see one another, and we organized frequently peace marches, where all leaders of non-religious and religious convictions spoke in the same way about non-violence, about mutual respect, and about progress. That was really a support for politicians in difficult times. And we even agreed upon the transparency of financing religions and so on. There were different protocols that we entered into. And I think it really helped in making citizens understand that religion or laïcité, whatever, could not be a cause of hatred or of violence. Of course, we cannot deny historically, and even in times wherein we live in, that religion has frequently been involved in inducing violence because certain religions claim an exclusivity or a universality, and because politically speaking, religions can serve in making an empire at a political level that also claims universality and exclusivity. But at the same time, you have to make understand people like, I don't know whether there are French scientists involved in this meeting, but you have to understand people that, or to make understand people that claim that laïcité is the only way of having a public life, that they're not necessarily right, that they also should understand and respect religions that have another concept of how things work. It is not easy, and certainly France there is a special case. Mila and the case of Paty have proven that, how difficult it is to confront those traditions in a country as France is. My second ambition has always been to design a legislation, a national legislation that creates a legitimate exception to freedom of speech in order to attain the legitimate purpose of non-hatred. As you know, under Article 10 of the European Treaty for Human Rights, we have freedom of speech with exceptions possible for public order, for respect of certain rights, and therefore a defense of hate speech and a well-drafted defense of hate speech is a primer or a priority for a Minister of Justice. Whether or not that speech induces violence. I do think we have done that in the right way without going to an emergency status. Belgium never during the crisis had anything like a noodtoestand ou une situation d'urgence. I do believe that a defense of blasphemy, a criminal defense of blasphemy, is in Western countries more and more a tendency that is difficult to justify. There is, I believe, not a right not to be offended. And the right answer to an offense is use your freedom of religion and use your freedom of speech yourself. The correct defense to blasphemy is freedom of speech. But of course, when blasphemy is at the same time a question of hate speech, even hate speech leading to violence, that's another matter. But blasphemy as such in a Western society is hard to forbid. That doesn't mean that there are no EU countries that still have a criminal defense of blasphemy. There is a famous case of the European Court of Human Rights 2018, wherein Austria won its case on blasphemy. It was a very special case where somebody in a seminar said that one of the marriages of Mohammed was a clear case of pedophilia, which gave a lot of problems. And the European Court unanimously held that the Austrian decision that justified such blasphemy, that forbade such blasphemy, was a decision to be upheld under the European Court of Justice. It was an enormous criticizing of that decision of the European Court in legal doctrine, but nonetheless, it was unanimous, also on appeal. Another ambition I had, and it is the last one, so within a few seconds, I will end, a few minutes maybe, that is that as a Minister of Justice, I try to contribute at the international level to a correct and collective discipline with regard to hate speech on the internet. That is probably the most complex part of the whole thing, because the multiplication of hate speech goes that fast and has such a large geographic impact that the European level will probably not be sufficient to master, will certainly not be sufficient to master the problem. At any rate, at this time, the European Commissioner, the former European Commissioner for Justice, and at this time, Vice President of the Euro Commission, Vera Jourova, is at this time defending a Digital Services Act, wherein internet providers are obliged to remove illegal content and hate speech from the internet whenever it is asked from them by the authorities. I will not go into detail, but just underline that this seems easy, and this is certainly absolutely necessary, but not without risk at the legal level, because the man or the woman that makes the hate speech can be subject, for instance, to Belgian law. But on the other hand, the servers of the internet provider, Facebook, for instance, may be on Irish territory. And so we will immediately have a problem of international conflict of laws. And at this time, the European Commission is trying to get hold of that problem. That, dear colleague Lambrechts, were the few comments I wanted to make with regard to your position paper from a political angle. But I can certainly underline what you did, that globalization and new social media create greater problems than ever with regard to the conciliation of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Thank you very much.
In a normal setting, we would all have applauded, thanking you for your comments, for your very helpful comments. They really go to the heart of what we were developing in our position paper, and you offer then, I think, an important political context for the work done by the many colleagues who are, well, the colleagues who are present also here today. And I'm quite confident that in the second half of this webinar, our French colleague will certainly have some comments on your position with regard to laïcité. So thank you very much for this very helpful comment on the paper and for the context in which you develop your own policy over the last years. Thank you very much. And now I will go to Elisa Di Benedetto, who will offer perspective from, let's say, from the side of the Association of Religion Journalists. Elisa, welcome again. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for having me here. And as you said before, I'm very thankful because you invited journalists here too. And to me, it's very, very important. And then I will explain why. I am a journalist. I cover religion and migration. I'm based in Italy. And I have the honor of being a co-managing director of the International Association of Religion Journalists, which is a global network of journalists covering religion and faith and spirituality, and working also to promote excellence in the coverage of these topics. We provide some services and resources to journalists so that can strengthen and support the work of our members. And we try to engage media leaders, educational institutions, and communities on the importance of accurate, balanced, and ethical religion coverage, and to foster, of course, understanding. The association was founded 9 years ago by some 25 journalists from different regions in the world. And we have been holding international conferences in Brazil, Argentina, in Ghana, Indonesia, in Europe as well. And the aim of these conferences is to bring together religion journalists so that they can share ideas, experiences, but also the challenges that they face in their work in covering religion and faith. It's not very often that journalists and scholars have the chance to discuss on topics like this. So I'm very happy to be here. We try to, in our conferences, we usually have some panels where journalists and scholars can discuss and share their perspectives, because maybe it might seem that we belong to two separate worlds, which are very different and maybe far away from each other. But there is no doubt that we need one another's work. And that's why I'm glad to be here. Because research provides journalists with the background information they need for their reporting and also data, which are very important. But I also think that journalism is important for scholars. Maybe I'm wrong, but I hope I'm not, because maybe we can offer stories and events. We talk about what is happening out there, and maybe this can start or drive the research sometimes. This is what I can imagine from reading your work. And so reporting on the present, maybe journalists can offer narratives based on everyday events. And of course, it's not based on documents and papers, but we also need your work. So this is very important. Sometimes I believe the challenge is that we have to write or to report. Maybe it's today for tomorrow, so we don't have the time to read a lot of research. We need to have that information, background information right away. And maybe sometimes researchers expect that we can give more time or space to their work, and it's not easy. So, and what I'm talking about is what I could get from the discussions we had with scholars in our conferences. I can see now that today one of the participants who is listening to us is one of the, well, now is a researcher, but he attended our conference in Ghana. And I'm very happy to see him here today, because it means that it's possible to still be in touch and work on these issues together. I was talking about challenges for journalists, and well, as the paper says, and I found many commonalities between our work and scholars' work in reading the paper. As the paper says, religions or the opposition to and the refusal of them are incarnated in the concrete lives of concrete human beings. And journalists are dealing with churches, mosques, with their sources. Their sources are religious leaders and the faithful. So journalists are working in these concrete situations. And they talk about behaviors. They give the chances to their voices to be heard. This is what we do. And to do that, we need background information, as I said. It's interesting how attitudes towards religion have an impact on one's research. When I read about that on the paper, I immediately thought about my work and my job and the challenges that religion journalists faces when they have to avoid that their own faith and confessional background affect their reporting. This is one of the big challenges, to be able to be fair, accurate, and balanced, despite our own faith. Sometimes it's not very easy, especially in interacting with our sources. Another big issue is religious literacy. Many times I've heard scholars telling me, you don't have religious literacy. Journalists should, yeah, I understand. And somehow it's true. But I think this is also related to the fact that religion is not considered as a beat. In many newsrooms, there are not journalists who are specifically covering religion. So it happens that maybe there is something that we need to cover, let's say an attack that might be related to religion, but there is no one there who has the background and the training to do that. And this is also a big problem that is related to the way the media is organized and how it works. So yeah, I see religious literacy is a big issue. And also because the media and journalists have a big responsibility, especially when it comes to enhancing stereotypes and prejudice. The big risks are simplification, generalizations. Before Dr. Gens said that it was talking about the different traditions we see now in Western countries. And this is also a challenge for journalists, being able to report on those different traditions. And the picture is always changing because religion is very complex. is a complex topic, also because of its intersectionality. Religion is related to politics, to migration, to social issues, cultural issues. Religion is not a bit, but we can say that religion it's involved in many different situations. And this is another challenge for journalists covering religion. The risk is the misrepresentation of religious traditions in our communities. Another thing that I would like to say is that, and here there is a responsibility by the media that there are some assumptions about religions which are embedded in our culture. For example, Islam being associated with violence and terrorism, and Buddhism with peace. And so there are many generalizations, or also thinking about a religion as a unicum without taking into consideration all the different traditions inside the same faith and religion. This is also some big issues that we should take into consideration. And then again, as journalists, we also have to deal with social media. Social media for us means new sources, new voices, but also fake news and hate speech that's related with social media. One of my colleagues from Sri Lanka, she is an anchor in Ada Derana TV, and in a conference 2 years ago in Utah, she was talking about how hard it was for her to cover the Easter bombing in Sri Lanka, the attack on Easter Sunday, because of social media and fake news. So as a journalist, she was also facing this big challenge, being able to report and in an accurate way and in a fair way while dealing with all this information being produced by social media. So these are just some examples to say that for us, it's very important to have background information. It's very important that we can have access in an easy and also quick way to resources. For us, it's very important. And as I read the position paper, I realized how many commonalities there are, as I said before. And I also think that both journalists and scholars, we are doing a service to society. And I think this is the thing, that the real commonality that we have, and it's very important to encourage religion reporting and expand the global network of journalists who report on religion with the right tools and resources. This is important to stop fake news and stereotypes. So I'm saying that, yes, we have a responsibility as journalists, but we also have good journalists doing their work. And we really appreciate that there is the willingness to create a platform that can provide resources also for journalists. That is very important. I see that we can work together for a better understanding of religion in society, because religion is something that we can find in any society somehow and somewhere. And it's important for us to talk about that and to cover religion in all the different ways that is impacting our society. So thank you for giving me the chance to share these ideas with you.
Thank you very much, Elisa, especially for the fact that you made clear that we have many things in common, but you also emphasized that information, collecting information for you is always an element of speed. You need it immediately, and you need information for tomorrow. You need it already yesterday, and also that is something we have to think about, and maybe you have to rework a bit here and there our position paper, in the sense that can we create platforms where we offer correct, good information to journalists. So thank you very much. Another journalist who was leaving his office, although he was under an enormous pressure to get his next issue ready, is Emmanuel van Lierde. And it's my pleasure and my honor to give him the floor. Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Professor Lambrechts. I'm very honored that you asked me to collaborate in this gathering today. I'm also honored because I am also an alumnus of the Faculty of Theology, and I also remember our nice cooperations for the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, where we collaborated a lot for our weekly to have different topics and issues on that great celebration. I've made some remarks on the proposition paper, more or less. I gathered them in 4 units, I would say. The first one is on the culture of rights. In the year 2018 in Tertio, we had a kind of a summer series on the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, and there were some remarks in that I want to share with you. In recent years, we do not only see a kind of increase, but also a domination of the discourse on fundamental and human rights, and this can be problematic in some cases. There are always more and more of these rights for more and more groups of people. But do these people then still have duties and responsibilities? What is the equilibrium between duties and rights? And we also see that this is no longer a discussion or a national responsibility. If these are legal rights, not a nation is judging on that, but there are new organs, international, supranational. Let's think of the European Court, or an international court is judging on this, and not a country on its own. So maybe it is a kind of loss of sovereignty. There are consequences for democracy in a country if others will decide what is right or what is duty. This can be asked that human rights maybe were in the first place more or less an ethical framework, but we see that they now dominate in justice and in law systems. We can even think today of the COVID situation. The laws are deciding on our rights, what to do or not. So Was the Declaration of Human Rights a philosophical statement or a political program or a jurisdiction? Or was it all three at the same time? That's a question that is interesting, I think. If we see these fundamental and human rights, they also promote a certain worldview and a certain kind of society. We could think as individual rights, it makes maybe our society more individualistic. Self-development and autonomy are central. This can be also already a case of conflict with religion. I come back on that. But once again, we see the increase of rights for more and more groups. We can think on the discussions there were on violence against women with the Me Too movement, or we have seen Black Lives Matter. Today, there is the discussion if we are woke or not woke. That's kind of political correctness, and maybe we will also be doing a kind of self-censoring, not saying some things because they are not political correct, or not using some terms anymore. Can I still say that in Dutch, if I'm blank person, or should I say that I am white? We are changing our words and making that we are political correct. But if we see that these human rights are counting for more and more groups, maybe they are not applicable for the rights on believers. Today we see that in some cases believers should shut up, they should be silent. There is a taboo on religion in modern society. We are no longer, as Christians, a majority in our culture, but maybe all people are one or a certain kind of minority. So we have a lot of minorities, but who's the majority? We see a kind of silent majority, maybe also. But what about this silence in regard with believers? I think it's said already, maybe the cause was terrorism, but I also think of abuse cases by religion. And these two things have made that religions have lost a lot of credentials to speak in our society. The social expressiveness is lost, maybe. I already remarked that sometimes there's a conflict between rights. There's a kind of hierarchy between the rights. And we've seen that during the COVID pandemic, which rights are important and which not, and who has the last word on this. So it's maybe also a case of power, who decides which rights are counting. We've seen that in our country, the freedom of religion was not that important. There was not many freedom to gather in churches or other places for worship. So it's a political decision, I think, and also sometimes a decision of judges who have the last word. So human rights and fundamental rights, it's also a case of power. I had also written down some things on the blasphemy, but Professor Koen Geens talked about that also already. Is there a right to insult the other? And where are the boundaries with freedom of speech? What can be said, what cannot be said? Are there red lines in this or not? But it's already a topic that was talked about. The second part of remarks I have, if there is already a freedom of conscience and a freedom of speech and also a freedom of association, do we then still need a specific freedom of religion? Some people say it's not necessary anymore because we have the other three. If we look to the history, Christianity has accepted and also promotes human rights, especially since the Second Vatican Council. The church even finds elements in its own tradition that motivates the defense of human rights. I also think of Thomas Aquinas, which already was in his thinking a point that the individual counted and not only the community, so that was already a basis for human rights. But as said, if we absolutize some human rights, it can also cause a conflict with religion. Think about the discrimination of women in ordained ministry. Some could say that it would be a human right, so that the church should implement this also in his ordained ministry. So there can be conflicts between human rights and religion. Also, I think of the discussions we had on the responsum of the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith on the blessings of non-hetero relationships. There can also in this case be a conflict that the church is still based his theories on natural law and not on human rights. I think the biggest conflict today and the fault line in society is between people with a secular worldview, starting by autonomy, and a religious worldview, starting by heteronomy. And I think it's also mentioned by Professor Koen-Geens, the clash of civilizations. We do not see it between civilizations, but within each society today. In regard of different worldviews, pluralism is everywhere, so it's not between societies worldwide, but within each society. Then my third group of remarks is about the reduction of religion to the private sphere. Also there we've seen it during the COVID pandemic that freedom of religions was not so important and that religion belongs to the private sphere, not to the public sphere. I also refer to a new essay that is coming up next week from our Belgian Cardinal Joseph de Kezel, who will publish this essay on religion in secular societies. It will also appear in French, so some of you will also be able to read it in French. He's also writing on this risk of the reduction of religion to the private sphere. The biggest risk for him is that religion then will go underground. And if it goes underground, we have no more control on it, what is happening. We can think of certain Islamic groups with no recognition and who go underground. It can lead to radicalization and can be a danger then. So it's better to recognize the public role of religions and give them space in the public sphere. That would be better. But I think we live not together with each other. We are living each separated in our ghettos sometimes. So I think we are also missing a kind of real active pluralism in society. As we talk on the positive role of religion in society and the relevance of religions for society, I want to refer to two things. First one is the discourse of French President Emmanuel Macron in the Collège des Bernardins. He was invited, I think, by the French bishops to talk there. And he talked about three gifts of Christianity for society: the gift of wisdom, the gift of your engagement, and the gift of freedom. And that these three gifts still can be given by Christianity to society. I personally find it remarkable that the French president talked about the gift of freedom that the church was giving to society. We can think, of course, of the letters of Saint Paul on freedom and a Christian view on freedom, but he was not referring to the French Revolution or the modern view of freedom, I think, but another kind of freedom that religion is bringing. So I recommend the speech of Emmanuel Macron there with the 3 gifts for society, and it refers also for me to another speech of Pope Paul VI during his discourse to the United Nations in New York, where he talked about Christianity as and church as an expert in humanity. Because of its tradition and its wisdom, it has this expertise in humanity, and for that it has a message to the world. And in this regard to the reduction to the private sphere, I also want to refer to the interview I myself had with Pope Francis in 2016, where he also used the 2 Spanish words, healthy laicidad, but an unhealthy laicismo. I think the church recognizes the distinction church-state and the separation between church and state. It is accepted since the Second Vatican Council, but this healthy distinction and separation does not mean an unhealthy reduction of religion to the private sphere. That was my 3rd part. I'm coming to the last one. It's about the part in the paper on narrating stories and writing history. A discussion we see there on this topic in our societies, also in the Netherlands, is a discussion and debates on the formation of a kind of canon. I don't know if it's the same word in English. The things you should know and you should learn about in school on history, culture, and literature. But I think these kinds of canons, they probably say more about today and on ourselves than about yesterday. It will always be a kind of colored viewpoint and a certain interpretation also already. The Netherlands have more experience on that already. In Belgium, the discussion is first starting on this forming of a canon, especially in the Flanders, the Dutch part of Belgium, I think. And there again, I would say, are we listening to each other? Is there really active pluralism? There is the sentence in the paper, people like to hear what they want to hear. I think that's indeed a big problem, and we see it a lot with social media. I also see it in reactions from readers or other people, even mostly non-readers, to what we write in our weekly. So you see people, they are only looking for a kind of confirmation for their own viewpoint and a confirmation for their own identity, but everything what is another opinion, it's very hard to accept it today. And so you see indeed people like to hear what they want to hear, and there's no real debate culture. And it certainly on social media, it can be very aggressive and very harsh to experience that. It's you need to have an elephant skin to cope with that sometimes as journalists. That were my 4 points of remarks. I hope I didn't take too much of the time. Thank you.
Very much, Emmanuel, for this valuable contribution to the discussion and to the paper, and also for the references you made to forgotten texts like the one of Paul VI, and to the text indeed of Macron, offering indeed some ideas about wisdom, engagement, and freedom as gifts of Christianity to society. Thank you very much for that. I'm quite confident that in the discussion we will come back to several of the questions you raised here. I only take 5 minutes to summarize what was offered by Vincenzo Pascillo. He is a full professor of canon law at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. And he reacted first on the separation of church and state. And as you can expect from a lawyer, he referred to the Council of Europe And the Council of Europe stressed that a primary and secondary education program should necessarily include concrete and objective information on major religions, on the principle of the comparative study of religions, and on ethics and personal and social rights. The other element he stressed is that in a recommendation by the Council of Europe, it is said that religious tolerance must enjoy the widest reflection. The third element, also taken from that Council of Europe, is that national education authorities must ensure that curricula of courses on religions and morals are included in public schools. In other words, religion, according to the Council of Europe and according to our respected colleague, should not put in the private sphere, but should offer as part of the educational program. And so where he also referred to the Toledo principles, which consider religious literacy. The Toledo principles were published in 2007, and they consider religious literacy as one of the main factors of social cohesion. When you take together the advice of the Council of Europe and the principles and the Toledo principles, then you need on the one hand education in religion, he says, and on the other hand, you have to work on religious literacy, and the two will go hand in hand. Then he also discussed blasphemy, but because both Professor Gaines and Emmanuel van Lierde mentioned that, I think I can leave that out here so that we have time enough for the discussion. But then he offered several wonderful insights with regard to the last point, with regard to the big data and the artificial intelligence. And here he said, any roboethics is a new word, it's ethics about robotica. Any roboethics roadmap cannot ignore the contribution of religions and beliefs to the debate on the relationship between ethics and robotics. He stresses that the temptation of the human being is that human beings become demiurges and therefore inevitably risk to lose the control of their own mechanical creatures, And here he says, I think there is a role for religions. Indeed, he adds, religions, and he gives then a definition of theology understood as a discourse of God and man in his relationship with God. He is of the opinion that religions can offer an important stimulus and critique towards the visions of secular roboethics. The relationship, he continues, between religions and roboethics is also played out within the debate on transhumanism, or on the possibility of eliminating the intellectual, biological, and physical limitations of the human being thanks to robotics and artificial intelligence. And here he says, the debate on transhumanism cannot be addressed without a perspective on the concept of human dignity that also involves religions. And he speaks of the concept of human dignity as one of those Ventilbegriffs capable of bridging the gap between the secularism of law and the great religious values that flow within society. And I think that we really have to rework the last part of our paper on the basis of what is said here in the interventions of Professor Vincenzo Pascillo, who was really disappointed that he could not be with us. And I'm quite confident that if he had to express himself, his position, he would have done that much better than I can do it here. But I hope that you got part of what he wanted to say to us today. So we have still 1 hour to discuss what was said by the 3 interveners, the 3 members of the panel. Also what was said in the position paper. Every participant received the position paper. So the floor is open for questions, for remarks. Maybe first among the 3 members of the panel. Or people want to react to what was said by the other speakers. No, according to Emmanuel, Professor James, Elisa Di Benedetto.
I just want to thank Emmanuel for mentioning the positive role of religion in society. And this is something we as journalists should be aware of, because it happens that we often find religion in the media as associated with conflict. But it's important also to talk about and cover interfaith dialogue, interreligious issues. There are many, many religious communities which are contributing to our society in different ways. And we often, well, sometimes we don't see any news about that in the media. And there are some new approaches which are focusing on that. I think of peace journalism, but also solution journalism and constructive journalism, which are really changing the perspective, or anyway adding new voices and a different approach to the news we are covering. And I believe this is very, very important, and we have to mention that. So thank you, Emmanuel, for talking about that. And also I appreciate that it's this positive role of religion is also in the paper. Thanks.
Okay. Professor Jens, yes, please.
Yeah, I only wanted to say one thing.
May I just intervene? When you look at the bottom of your screen, you can see that you can react and raise your hand. That's for the others, not for you, Professor Jens. Continue, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry not to have raised my virtual hand. I just wanted to thank Emmanuel van Lierde for the healthy distinction between healthy laicism and unhealthy laicismo, because maybe I was not very nuanced in what I was implying there. The only thing about the culture and the conviction of laïcité, which I wanted to underline, is that it can become a little bit fanatic itself. And the basic concern of a Minister of Justice, and it is out from that position, not an academic position, that I reacted, is to ensure what I would call religious peace. And not only between religions amongst themselves, but with all philosophical convictions. And if there is a claim of that it has to be what it is, either from the religious side or from the non-religious side, it becomes difficult to understand one another. But I will readily admit that the French conviction was a big progress for Western societies. Only today, in the multicultural environment we live in, we have to be very prudent, because what the concern, again, of a politician is not to have violent conflict in a society. And I think it's that what the European Court in 2018 tried to understand in its decision on Austria. I think this decision would never have been taken 15 years ago by the European Court, but it has been taken now probably because of the fear that there might be a violent conflict. And you cannot have that in our societies. It's much worse from time to time than the expression of an unhealthy opinion. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you very much.
Okay. As far as I can see, nobody is raising her hand. Then I asked Denis Pelletier to react as the one who contributed very much to the paper and discussed the laïcité, to reflect a bit or to react or to discuss a bit his position on laïcité with our colleague, Professor Geens. Denis.
Yes, okay, Matthijs. And many thanks to Professor Geens and Elisa Di Benedetto and Emmanuel van Lierde for their commentaries about our text. First, before beginning, I would like you to believe me if I tell that I am not here to convince you that the French laicist system is the best one. It's not my purpose, and you will not know if it is my conviction or not. It's not my purpose, of course. My purpose is the following one. As a French citizen, I have been educated in a secular and laicist environment. And so I live in a country, and as a citizen of this country, I can think that if you don't accept to mock religion, if you don't accept blasphemy, if you don't accept to laugh about religion, you are not a good Republican. I have been educated in such an environment. And so, as a French citizen, as 80% of my concitoyens, of the other French people, I think what I just told you. Okay, you will not know if personally I think that, but 80% of French people think that if you are not blasphemating, if you don't accept blasphemy, you are not a good Republican, because blasphemy is a question of freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. Okay, what I try to say, what I try to do when I speak with you or when I propose a text to Matthijs about this situation, what I try to do is to suspend my moral judgment, to suspend the judgment for explaining you how this situation can happen in France, how this situation can happen. How can we live in such an intellectual and political environment? And for instance, the case of Mila, the young Mila. For me, the case of Mila is first a very sad. It's a very sad story. It's a very sad story because, of course, Mila, 16 years old, should have better shut her mouth. And she said very, very stupid things, but she is 16. And so when you are 16, maybe you don't know what you are telling. And what is difficult to understand and what is so sad is that Mila, in a few days, became, on one hand, the Republican voice by excellency. She was transformed in the Republican voice by excellency. And in other hand, she received threats of murder, threats of rape, and she is a 16-year-old girl. And so what is interesting for me interesting because I suspend my judgment, my moral judgment, is the fact that this situation comes in France in that way. But that, I think that every country has the same type of difficulty. The same type of difficulty with, on one hand, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, which are not the same things. As a professor, I need my freedom of conscience. But as a professor, I don't have a freedom of expression. But Elisa, as a journalist, needs a freedom of expression. And there is a question of institution and of relationship between our rights and the institution, the democratic institution in which we are working. And in one hand, we have these three freedoms. And in the other hand, we have first the globalization, and second, the way in which social networks transform this globalization. And I think that the question of religion is very interesting as a laboratory, an observatory to understand how globalization in one hand transform our proper relationship with the different freedoms I was speaking about a few seconds ago. And that's all. We need to understand that. And I think that it is a real political difficulty, and not a French difficulty, but a European difficulty. And what is interesting to understand is the way in which each country with its proper culture encounters this difficulty, is confronted to this difficulty. And in that way, of course, religion is a very, very helpful, a very, very interesting, and sometimes a very tragic observatory of this situation, of this actual situation.
Any reactions from the members of the panel on this intervention of Denis Pelletier? Denis Pelletier, who is active as professor at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. If not, then I would like to hear the comments of Marcelo Verga on the intervention of Emmanuel van Lierde with regard to the canon. For Verga once taught me that canons and things like that have to do with heritage, but not with history. So I would love to hear Marcelo explaining that again to Emmanuel van Lierde. Marcelo.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you very much, and thank you also for this webinar. It's very important for us, for our debate on the topics of our work group and the workshop.
So maybe you can introduce you shortly to the audience, for many do not know you.
In the context of the project ReIReS, of course, and I want to mention, to reflect with you on a point very well mentioned in the position paper. That from my point of view, I am a historian. I am a scholar of the early modern European history. That the development of the civil rights, the modern discourse of rights, is linked with religious history issues in our countries, in Europe. The idea of the freedom of the speech, the freedom of the conscience, for example, the freedom of believe or not believe in God, is a result of religious wars from 16th to 17th to 18th centuries. And I think that that from our point of view, from our professional job of European historians, I think that we can remember this point. That also in our time, also in our days, we can remember. I think that is useful to remember that that the history of the freedoms of the rights is linked with the confrontation, with the discussion of religious issues. And what Denis said before, I think that we can remember this context, this long historical path of the history of the European rights. And then I agree with Denis, of course. I have many occasions for discussing with Denis, and I think that it's very useful to transform ReIReS project. One of the results of the ReIReS project is also construction of the Observatory of Religion today in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. In his intervention, Emmanuel several times mentioned the COVID crisis, and he had his doubts about the presence of freedom of religion in this matter. If I remember well, there was a huge debate, and there was even a conflict and kind of a riot in the Netherlands. So I would love to hear the comments of Herman Selderhuis or Paul van Geest on the position of Emmanuel van Lierde with regards to religious freedom and COVID, because in the Netherlands they took religious liberty more seriously, and there was even, if I'm not mistaken, a riot, a religious riot in Urk. So can you comment on that, Herman or Paul?
Yes, of course. First of all, we are quite known for riots. That is how we got our independence a long time ago. And that relates also directly with religion. So we, from our perspective, and especially the Protestant part of the nation, has good experience with religion and rights. Although I think the Catholic side has a different opinion on that, at least the Spanish side. I think the Dutch Catholics are somewhat different in this. There is even one said by a Dutch Catholic author that even the Catholics in the Netherlands are Calvinists, so we are all rioters. I think the issue you referred to was indeed not so much the discussion on the rights of churches, although it went quite far, but I think also kind of first miscommunication between political measures and communication with the churches. Also, I think not to defend those that attack the press, but also this specific approach of some journalists towards churches that gave rise to strong reactions, especially by younger people. So you can be, as journalists, so much present that you just wait or solicit for a reaction in order to make negative news about churches, religions, mosques, whatever. So I think that is, but that brings me to, I think, a fundamental question also in our discussion. And I think it was mentioned especially by Elisa Di Benedetto about the good news from religious side. We can, of course, look at this topic from the perspective from religions towards politics and society and rights. But maybe we could also turn it around and see should not religions themselves ask questions? How do we communicate our standpoints? How do we demonstrate our positive presence in order to omit a situation in which religions and representatives of religions only take apologetic attitudes and go into the defense? So I think this whole discussion and the topic of our seminar is also a message to religions of what kind ever to see how do we demonstrate what we stand for, how can we communicate and spread good sound knowledge about where we stand. And that can include also, and that is what we have seen in the situation that you mentioned, that also churches and representatives of churches in this case, they publicly distance themselves from these kind of riots towards the press, although they did ask for understanding. And I think some did well, but we need to be more alert on these things from the side of religions, religious persons, but also faculties working with religion and theology. But maybe Paul can add something to that.
Well, a little bit. What I think happened in Urk was, and even in Krimpen aan de IJssel, which is a village where we live very nearby, well, people considered it as a kind of an utterance of a very subtle suppression of some churches, mostly Protestant churches in the Netherlands. So we have, well, as the Dutch are used to be very pluralistic. And we have lots of churches, church communities, and so on and so forth. And there are some, not mainstream Protestantism or mainstream Catholicism in Holland, but there are some communities, relatively small, well, in the south of South Holland, the province, which are kept or keep themselves pretty isolated. And they have these strict division between the church and the world in their perception. So contrary to the words Augustine is saying, the church does have walls. And that means there's not really a dialogue in the community itself. The Lord Mayor of Krimpen, whose father was a theologian or a philosopher, by the way, at VU University, Martijn Vroom, who is a religious person or a churchgoer himself, he, well, let's say, saw these strict isolations of the church community as the main reason for the extreme reaction of church-going people on this Sunday morning attacking journalists. So there was a kind of a volcano reaction, which had to do with their vision on the world, and on the other hand, had to do with the vision of the people in the village or in the town towards the church-going people of this small community. So that's what happened in Urk. That's what happened in Krimpen aan de IJssel. And what happened in Krimpen aan de IJssel actually was a very good thing. People started dialoguing. How have we come so far in our pluralistic, secularized society that we are going to attack each other? Journalists, by aiming words at church-going people, we are always, or not always, but we are sometimes, well, there we are mocked at in a way. But on the other hand, from the part of these church-going people in Krimpen aan de IJssel, there was physical attacks. So how have we come that far that this happened? So there was a kind of a dialogue which solved the well, more or less a kind of a problem, that the journalists became aware of the fact that they are subtly oppressing these communities by insisting on their isolation in words and mocking at that. And well, the church-going people were confronted with the fact that there is no good reason to attack physically journalists because we live in a country with a freedom of press. So in the end, I'm inclined to think that there was a kind of a catharsis in this specific area in Holland. And well, there's another point, but then I will end. What I wrote in a Dutch journal in the beginning of the corona was that the churches were, well, I don't know the real expression in English, but they were more Roman than the Pope. So the government insisted on closing down almost the church for liturgical services. We all did. The Catholics, well, they were all, the Dutch Bishops' Conference, they were almost too polite in a way, because what happened was that people who wanted to have, for the corona patients dying, wanted to have the sacraments for the last sacraments, the unctio. Well, the clergy were simply forbidden to be helpful as pastors to the dying people in the hospitals. And there the bishop should have said, no, if people are dying, the state always should allow a clergyman to enter the hospital in order to assist a dying person. We were too polite in this respect. So these are the 2 points I want to emphasize with respect to the situation in Holland after or during Corona.
Professor Geens wants to intervene. He raised his hand. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very shortly, first on Professor Pelletier. I again want to underline my respect for French laïcité. Only the concern of a politician, and I'm as neutral as you are with regard to the expression of my views, but the concern of the politician is how to avoid that a girl as Mila or somebody else, or a magazine as Charlie Hebdo becomes the object of violence. Because once the violence is there, you have a responsibility for public order. I have no solution, but it's a very difficult issue. Second, with regard to freedom of religion during Corona, I've been amazed about the number of rights that we are ready to give up for public health, that we are not ready to give up for safety or for security. It's unbelievable. And it shows that the investments of society in public health, which are exponentially higher than the investments in security and safety, are worthwhile, because this is really the conviction of public opinion. However, I must admit, and now I speak as a Christian Democrat, that I've also been amazed by the little pressure developed by believers for exercising their rights. And personally, I've once, I hope the journalists will not be too open on what I'm saying now, I once made a move in order to have not only visits of a pastor to dying people, but also of their families, or of at least some members of their family. And there was a great silence. And the same thing goes for funerals, that you can postpone a wedding, I understand. But if you can only be 15 at a funeral, I was amazed that I did not hear more demands. There is, of course, a law of non-discrimination, and I understand that if you cannot have a feast or a gathering, you cannot go to a funeral. But I have been amazed. And I think that as far as Belgium is concerned, one of the elements was that many believers are older people, I'm sorry to say so, and that there was also a fear that the Muslim religion would not master discipline when there were larger gatherings. But I've been personally dazzled by the fact that visits to hospitals and to the homes of the elderly were totally barred without any protest. I did not understand. And I was rather alone in that. So I hope next time the Catholic community will do better. And not only the Catholic.
So thank you very much. Arthur Kasperzak raised his hand. Please, Arthur.
Thank you very much.
And you can do it in French. I mean, the members of the panel have no problem with French. And the people in the Netherlands, they are very fluent in French, for they welcomed at the time of Louis XIV, thousands and thousands of French-speaking people in the Netherlands. So go ahead.
I will try in English, or sometimes I will use French words. Of course, French is it's my best possibility way to say. So I work in the Faculty of Theology in Warsaw, University of Cardinal Wyszyński, and I would like to thank you for this subject and the study of this relationship between the state and the church. What I would like to say, it's not, I am not Jean-Jacques Rousseau to say that I believe God only in the Bible. So in this way to say that I understand what the Professor Pelletier has said about this solution in French. It works very well, but I would like to say that the function of religion is a love, is to reconciliation. We have many value, very important, like peace, but especially the vision of the future. And I would like to use the word adventus, so l'espoir, l'espérance. I think that it is a real problem in this relationship between state and the churches or religions, that it is an institutional problem. As a Professor Apeldoorn has said, I mean, in the same way, that is perhaps not a problem of the states we have in United Europe today, even if this many different models of relationships between religions and state. But the problem perhaps is with institution of our possibility in our religions to give this vision of the future, of adventus, of espérance, hope for human being. Peut-être en français, ça va être plus simple à la fin. C'est tout simplement, je pense un peu comme Thomas Halleck, il l'a utilisé dans un article il y a 3 ans, ça a été traduit en polonais. En fait, une phrase, je traduis en anglais, today we are witnessing a new cultural revolution, global revolt against elites, surge or liquid anger. This anger has been given its tools, social media. Et après, justement, dans cet article, il parle du problème de médias et justement de ce sentiment de violence qui se répand. Et ma question est suivante. Est-ce que nos religions en Union européenne, est-ce que nous avons notre responsabilité d'avoir des outils d'abord au niveau des religions et de diminuer cette tension, en fait, cette sorte de, justement, globale de cette tension au niveau des émotions des gens. Et peut-être c'est la question justement de cette régulation ecclésiastique, religieuse et institutionnelle, bref. Voilà, c'est ma question. Merci pour la patience pour mon anglais.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anybody who wants to react on this intervention? Otherwise, I would like to ask a question to all of you in the comments of our esteemed colleague from Modena. He says that according to the Council of Europe, we need in the primary and secondary education programs concrete, and now it comes, concrete and objective information on major religions. I have two questions for you. The first is, and it's a question to all of you, is objective information possible after the intervention of Emmanuel on the canon and of Marcelo Verga on heritage? Is that possible, objective? And second, what do we mean when we speak of the major religions? Who will determine what are major religions? And how can you reconcile that with the freedom, with religious liberty and the freedom of conscience and so on? I would love to hear the comments of this respected audience, and I'm quite confident that Jaap Geeraas has certainly something to say about that, for he contributed to the part where we have the differences in historiography because of differences in a denominational background. Jaap, would you start the discussion?
Sure, Matthijs, happy to reflect on that. Yeah, so I mean, where to start really? I think the part I wrote for the position paper you all have read is reflecting on on the history of Catholicism in the Dutch Republic mainly, on which I focus in relation to, you know, the influence of someone's denominational or confessional background on the history he or she wrote. And what you really see is that for quite a long time and until fairly recently, the confessional background of some Catholic historians was still fairly prominently visible in the work they did. That doesn't mean at all, of course, that the work was completely worthless. On the contrary. But you could certainly see, and I used as an example, Lodewijk Rogier, one of the most well-known Dutch Catholic historians of the 20th century, where he says, for instance, okay, Protestantism, when it, you know, came up in the Dutch Republic in the 16th and 17th centuries, was really sort of was a top-down project. It was the authorities sort of, they spread Protestantism, which didn't sort of spread organically among the people of the Dutch Republic themselves. This, I argue, these sort of confessional sentiments have been partly eroded, largely because historians like myself don't have, you know, any confessional background whatsoever, which does raise interesting questions about religious literacy, but I will park that for the moment. And also because of all kinds of economical developments, as a result of which that polemical aspects of earlier histories of Protestantism and Catholicism have receded fairly much to the background. Now, these are to a large extent, I think, very good developments which should be applauded. But what I also argue is, like, look, historians with a more firm confessional imprint, if you like, might have had their own sort of blind spots. But it doesn't mean that historians of newer generations who maybe don't have this, confessional baggage, carry this confessional baggage with them, don't have their own particular blind spots that might be caused by having been raised in, in a non-religious context. So relating all of that to your question, Matthijs, about objective information, I think we all know that we can't be completely objective. It's just, impossible. So I think what we should welcome, and what has become more and more normal, is that the field is much more diversified. Again, looking at Catholic history, these are no longer only clergymen who study their history and write for their parish, so to speak. But the field has become really diverse, and it's because of these different perspectives, people coming from different backgrounds. I think that's really helpful to get that information, which is not completely objective, but is more comprehensive and more reflective of different perspective and approaches that people use to study the past. And then very briefly to your second question, the major religions, I have no clue. I mean, the simplest way would be just counting, I guess, just counting the number of church members and, base your selection on that. But whether that's useful or whether then, again, you miss religions which are maybe smaller in numbers, but which are really influential, probably that is the case. But how to deal with that question, I don't know, to be honest.
Okay, I see that Emmanuel raised his hand. Emmanuel.
Because you challenged me, of course, I raised my hand. My remark on the canon was not that there is no objective knowledge. So I agree with the previous speaker, Jaap Gerards. Of course, we have some objective facts. There are 12 apostles and not 15 or something, even though we can discuss already maybe 13. And we can talk about Islam with 5 pillars and the sacraments and so on. So we have objective facts, but if we make a kind of canon, I think it's also already kind of interpretation, what we put together in it and what we want to reach with that. And that will be the same. We have the objective facts, but what will we be giving in the classroom, and how will we bring it to the pupils? And of course, the teacher will have his interpretation or use it in a certain way. So there will also be the discussion on interpretation, I think. But I agree with what Jaap Gerards has said about it. So it was already resolved.
I have 2 other people who want to take the floor. Chiara first, and then Inese.
Yes, hello. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hello, I'm very excited to be joined this evening to this panel. I want to bring my own expertise to the discussion because I'm actually a Christian archaeologist. So I'm on the other side of history, which is the practical side of the research. And I've been investigating for ages now the reception of Christian antiquity in modern Europe from the Counter-Reformation and especially until the pontificate of Pius XI. So it's a very big span of time. And I'm very interested also in how this part of religious history, of Christian history, is communicated on to the common readers and the common audience. And I really want to appreciate what Elisa Di Benedetto has said about create good information for journalists, and at the same time being very interested in communicating our religious heritage. Because sometimes, especially in Italy, which where I'm from Rome actually, we always have this cyclical fashion news about the catacombs, which are obviously the first tangible heritage of Christianity in Europe and North Africa actually. And we always hear about catacombs and early Christian heritage in press and from journalists, especially from journalists, under a sensational point of view. For example, in catacombs we have paintings about priests which were women, which is absolutely false, but actually this is something that it always appears cyclically in the in press. And I think that it's time for us, especially for us from the Roman school, which has been everybody always says that we are very confessional, but actually with the with the new generation things are changing actually. It's up to us trying to build a bridge with journalists and people who write about early Christian times, early Christian religion and history, trying to be the most scientific as possible. So this is an issue that I think that we are really called for, and this is our duty as historians of early Christian religion. And this is something that I wanted to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Inese.
Evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
First of all, I'm very happy to participate in this seminar and lectures. So listening all of the presentations and kind of trying to understand the different directions that could be taken by scientists, academicians, by journalists, by secular people, non-believers, whatever we can say, in the different communities. Actually, I've come to the one very, from my perspective, very important topic. It's the duty of the religious communities in the debate about religious freedom. The duty, this is, I mean, of course, for example, we can educate the general audience. We can bring the religious, the subject of religion to the public schools. And I think intellectually it would be a very important task to educate the society, to prevent blasphemy, hate speech, and so on and so on. Also to sustain the freedom in general. But the issue, the responsibility and the duty of the religious communities to do the formation, appropriate formation, according to the 10 Commandments, according to the main ideas of each particular religion, and so on and so on. So, because otherwise it's useless. So, if the general audience will be educated enough intellectually, then probably the religious communities will not be able to spiritually respond to the issue of the education. So, for example, being a Roman Catholic in a very secular, in a Protestant country, for me it's very sometimes complicated to argue about the Catholic response to the freedom if my community, my own community, does not really care of the issue as a freedom. If there's no appropriate free space for debating different important issues within the community, so how can we be good citizens and be responsible regarding to the freedom issues, supporting the issue of the freedom and religious freedom in general society, and for example, that could be a kind of case. Just recently I was doing the research about the history of diplomatic relations between the Holy See and Latvia. And then finally, what do we see? It's kind of illustration, silly, probably a little bit sarcastic illustration, but the secular and the Protestant diplomats of Latvia in the 20s and the 30s, in the interwar period, used to be more Catholics than the Catholic ones, because they understood the importance that the importance of the relations between the Holy See, because the relations with the Holy See, it's on one side guarantees recognition, international recognition. Also, it guarantees the freedom. It's a matter of the religious freedom. And on the opposite side, we have a Catholic ecclesial authorities who think much more about money, strengthening their private positions, and so on and so on. So if it's not going both directions, if the issue of the religious education and religious freedom is much more debated, sustained, and actualized in a secular society, but not within the communities. Of course, we have to observe the traditions, we have to take into consideration canon law and whatever we can imagine. But this is like two directions. For example, another illustration. Like in the 80s, there was a book published by Rodney Stark, American religious sociologist. I think it was in his book called "The Rise of the Christianity." And back in the second and the third century, Anno Domini, the Christianity became so powerful and energetic community. But why it happened and why it was attracting so many people, changing their lives and being transformative? Because actually Christians lived out all of those beliefs that they believed. Yeah, they were not only formal Christians, but they were active Christians, contributing to the change of the society and so on and so on. So this is something that's very important. Yeah, so to educate not only secular non-believers, environment, milieu, but also being responsible within the community and community contributing to this. Thank you.
Elisa, you raised your hand and you have the floor.
Thank you. I just wanted to tell Chiara that, yeah, Chiara, I see what you mean, and I totally agree with you. And that is a problem indeed. Sensationalism and also misinformation. And it's very important, as you said, that we find a way so that you can communicate with us and that we are able to convey the proper information. And I just wanted to say that last year, well, 2 years ago, together with FSHIRE and in the frame of the European Academy of Religion, we launched a religion journalism award called the Piazza Grande Religion Journalism Award. And we received many stories, and it was amazing that we received stories that were not just about conflict, but also about religious archaeology and many different topics. So we launched this award for awarding excellence in religion journalism, and we had some very encouraging stories, and that's very good. Just a quick comment from my personal experience about education at school. In Italy, we have Catholic religion education at school, but there are many teachers who are talking about other religions. And where I live, which is a small town in the Dolomites Mountains, a few years ago, I happened to cover a story of a school where some teachers and the director, they invited an imam to meet the students so that they could ask him questions about Islam. And some families, they didn't agree. So they had to cancel this meeting with the imam. The mayor of this town, he arranged the meeting outside the school, and that was great, and there was a very interesting discussion. But this is just to show how hard it can be, I think. So maybe having religious education about different religions maybe could help also dialogue if it's something that is supposed to be there at school. Another thing which I found very interesting when I was in Ghana, I bought some books that the religion books they use at primary schools. And it's very interesting because they have a chapter about family, and then it talks about family in Christian families, Muslim family, and traditional religion families. So kids, they learn at primary school what it means to live in a different religion family. And so this is family, but other cultural issues related to different religions. And I think that was very, very interesting. Maybe it's off topics, but I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As far as I can see, there's a last question. Yes, please. You have to unmute yourself.
May I briefly introduce myself?
Yeah.
My name's Stefan Wendhorst from the law department of the University of Vienna, and I was invited yesterday, so please cut me short if I say something stupid. Probably I've joined the discussion rather late in the day. There are just two observations I should like to throw in and one question I would like to ask. Two observations. I like this comment by Ines Ruins about the Latvian diplomats in the interwar period who were more, although very Protestant, were more Catholic than the Catholics because they knew they had to know about such things in order to enhance their the diplomatic status of their contested sovereignty. There is an interesting observation to be made with regard to the German diplomatic service. As has been remarked, the main preoccupation is, of course, political business and economic business of a foreign ministry today. But I think it was 2 or 3 years ago that a small department for religious affair was set up for the first time at the German diplomatic service, because the need was felt that one, in order to understand what was going on in the Middle East or something, other hotspots of the world, the diplomatic service did no longer have the capacity, basically, to make sound judgments. Yeah. The other observation I wanted to make is this question: what is a major religion, or which should be accepted as a major religion? And here I think those countries who still don't have a separation between state and church, who still have something like, I know the term doesn't really exist in English, public ecclesiastical law. The French have forgotten about it, droit public ecclesiastique, I suppose, Staatskirchenrecht in German. They have really practical ideas about this. I mean, it's a question of numbers, it's a question of organization, and you have to fulfill minimum criteria to be accepted as a religious group. So there is perhaps something on that practical level that may help along the discussion. And the question I really have is, I'm being not familiar with the French scene at all. Yeah, I would be very curious, and having heard about this lecture by Macron for the first time, to what extent, say, in France, there is now a discussion whether one should have something like public ecclesiastical law, again, simply whatever one thinks of religion, but simply to establish channels of communication between the state and religious communities. I mean, talking here from an Austrian perspective, the Austrians have been, you could say, masterminds, yeah, of integrating all sorts of different nationalities and religions, the first to draft Jews into the army before the French Revolution, and to get official sanction from the chief rabbi of Prague for Jews to perform their military duties, or the first country in Europe to accept the Muslims as a church. Yeah, under the terms of public ecclesiastical law. So I'm wondering, in France, is this at all a topic, yeah, to re-establish something like public ecclesiastical law?
I think that the only one who can give a beginning of an answer is Denis Pelletier. Denis, do you have any comments on? It's an intriguing question, anyway.
There is no. It's the question of a public ecclesiastical law in France. There is a real difficulty. There is a real issue with building a discussion between political persons and religious leaders. And this is strongly difficult. This is difficult, especially with Muslim. And in France, we usually explain that by the fact that there is no a unique authority. In Islam, in Catholicism, there is an authority. In Judaism, you can't find it, and Napoleon built it. And for Islam, it's more difficult. But it is the official explanation. But of course, the difficulty with Islam is linked to inheritance of history, inheritance of colonization, and is linked to many other difficulties. And so, for a part, it is a French history. Colonization, laicism is a French history. But for another part, it is a European difficulty, which is how do we speak with a religion which appears for us as a new religion in our public space, in our public landscape. And for answering in another way to a question of Matthijs, which are the main religions which would be learned in the gymnasium. I have been for a long time professor of history in gymnasium and in collegium. For me, excuse me, Matthijs, the question is not falsely relevant. When you are a teacher of history, you don't have to learn all history to your pupils, to your students. The real question, it is not the knowledge of religion which will give us tolerance and peace and so forth and so on. What is important is that we explain to our students and to our pupils that our model of democracy, our model of public space has been built through a long and sometimes difficult relationship between religion and politics. And that is the main question. And the second question is perhaps that politics of life in one way and politics of globalization in the other way are changing now the basis of our public space and the basis of our democratic space. And that is a real question. And that is a reason for we can begin again to work about the relationship between religion and politics, to understand what is changing now, because it's a way in which we can understand what is changing and work with it. And for me, it is the purpose of ReIReS, and it is the reason for we are talking together now.
Okay, thank you very much. I will hand over your answer to Vincenzo Pascillo, for he said it was not me. So the question I raised was on the basis of his text. I will hand over the answer to him. I think that we are...
Sorry, Matthijs, sorry, excuse me.
I think that we are coming to the end of this webinar. For we had said this between 4 and 6, and I can imagine that people have other commitments. But I do not want to let you go before thanking our 3 members of the panel, Koen Geens, Elisa Di Benedetto, and Emmanuel van Lierde, for a valuable contribution to this afternoon and for the stimulating reflections. I want to thank all those who contributed to the position paper, for it was on the basis of their ideas and their reflections that we had this meeting. I want to thank all those who intervened and all those who were present this afternoon. It's very much appreciated. And last but not least, I have to thank very much Lineke Timpers, who with the help of Carla Boersma was able to guarantee that the technical part of this meeting was more than okay. So thank you all. Thank you for being with us. Have a nice evening. And whenever you want to react on the position paper through email, feel free, send your comments. For the other people writing on the position paper, all what is said, I will try to bring it in somewhere in our position paper. And after the weekend, you will receive a more or less better corrected text than what you received the previous week. Is that okay? So have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you.